I must confess that I have found it difficult to know what and how to speak to you this Rosh Hashanah morning. Should I address the state of our world, the disasters that have occurred this past week in Morocco and Libya, where tens of thousands are feared dead and more are displaced? Should we call to mind the earthquakes, cyclones, hurricanes and storms, the burning temperatures and fires that have devastated parts of Europe, Canada and Hawaii this past year? Or the damage done to the delicate ecosystems that have been ravaged by intensive industrialization, the warming of our climate, rising sea levels, the risk, the frightening risk that our actions or inactions now and in the immediate future may all but lock us into some existential catastrophe befalling future generations. In a few moments, we will recite the medieval poem known as the Unatani Tokef. Let us proclaim the holiness of this day, a day of deepest awe. Our Mahsor may have redacted its central paragraph because of the disturbing fatalistic ring of its message, or because we struggle with the idea of a transcendent and powerful God as the agent of natural disaster and disease. But its words that compel us to consider how judgment is formed on Rosh Hashanah and how judgment is sealed on Yom Kippur are still deeply resonant for all who pass away and all who are born, for all who live and all who die, for those who complete their normal span and those who do not, who perish by fire or water, by the violence of man or the beast, by hunger or thirst, by disaster or execution. They are a true and tragic reflection of the loss and sadness that beset families when someone dies before their time, of catastrophes in villages and cities, in coastal areas or in mountainous regions, in times of warfare, and in the daily struggle for survival by so many. Perhaps it is timely to address the instability and inequalities in our own nation, the images of crumbling schools, hospitals and theatres, or the extremes of wealth and poverty, the crisis of immigration, and how to care for the thousands who put their lives in danger by sailing through perilous waters to seek asylum in this country. Closer to home for us as Jews, it is hard to avoid addressing the precarious situation in Israel. Since January the 7th of this year, Israelis have taken to the streets and squares in cities every week after Shabbat to protest against the reform of Israel's judiciary, legislation that would limit the power of the Supreme Court and the government's legal counselors and grant the governing coalition a majority on the committee that appoints judges. As the court hearing began on Tuesday of this week, considering the constitutionality of the law to eradicate the reasonableness standard, Israel's fragile democracy, the principles of separation of powers, the rule of law and human rights are in jeopardy. The court will hear additional written arguments over the next weeks before it gives its final decision. If the court strikes down the law, says Orly Erez Lechovsky of Israel's Religious Action Center, we will have to wait for the next case in which the reasonableness standard would be applied by the court to see whether the government would respect that. Perhaps on Rosh Hashanah, there is an expectation to address the state of our own Jewish community here in the UK, our spiritual and moral health, as well as the increase in the number of anti-Semitic incidents recorded this year, the 6th highest ever recorded. They include vandalization of tombstones, an increase in online abuse, incidents in schools involving children both as victims and perpetrators, the most common of these discourses making reference to Hitler, the Nazis, or the Holocaust. And more relevant to these festivals is the searching in our own heart for our failures and fears, for our indifference and indolence, for our selfishness and silence in the face of injustice and wrongdoing. The unanswered questions: what more could we be doing? In looking back at the past year, we cannot be indifferent to what we see around us and our collective and personal responsibilities. And yet, we must not leave our service today burdened by the weight of the world's woes, by guilt, by the stress and anxiety that we are living in a world at risk from the disintegration of moral values, or at worst, existential risks to our planet, to our society, to the state of Israel, to the Jewish people, and to ourselves. So what are the messages of hope we can share with each other at the beginning of this new year? How can our own Jewish teachings instruct us to mitigate against those risks, to safeguard our future, and to plant seeds of optimism and faith? That we read the story of the birth of Isaac and the expulsion of Hagar and Ishmael on Rosh Hashanah is, as I said earlier, a curious tradition, although not the oldest. We might have expected the Torah reading, prescribed in the earlier text of the Mishnah, to come from Leviticus 23, part of the calendar of festivals referring to the first day of the month of Tishri as Zichron Teruah Mikra Kodesh, a sacred occasion commemorated with loud blasts. Then the Torah reading would have been only 3 verses instead of the 20 you heard earlier. On the other hand, when we consider that creation is the major drama of Rosh Hashanah, perhaps the Torah reading should have been the first chapter of Bereshit, Genesis, and the creation of the first human being, created in the divine image, in the image of God, male and female. This surely would have been more consistent with Rabbi Eliezer's statement in the Talmud, but Tishri nivra ha'olam, in Tishri the world was created, or the verses in the Mahzor, Hayom Harat Olam, this is the birthday of the world. Instead, we have not a cosmic drama, but the crisis of a failed surrogacy, a domestic dysfunction that ends at this moment in the story, in the narrative of Bereshit, in a sense of loss for each character in the tale. Abraham loses his son, Ishmael. Isaac and Ishmael lose each other as brothers. Sarah loses any sense of the possibility that this family can be integrated or blended in some way. And Hagar, who casts her son under a bush, waiting for him to die, remains disempowered, tied to her son, potentially the victim always of oppression. It is perhaps unusual to draw on mystical traditions of the Kabbalah in a liberal synagogue, but they allow for a different and powerful reading of optimism. So please bear with me as we search for those seeds of hope. In mystical, Kabbalistic traditions, Abraham, whose tent was open on all sides, represents the quality of chesed, loving kindness, an expansive and generous hospitality. His love and obedience to God is without restraints or limits, to the point, somewhat counterintuitively, of being willing to see the death of both his sons. Isaac, on the other hand, whose birth we just read about, represents gvura, strength, judgment, the power to set limits and boundaries, withstanding as he did the test of the Akedah. The two are diametrically opposed, but one entity, two sides of the same coin. For the mystics, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, set against this great cosmic drama of creation, is a journey to discover how these two forces, exemplified in two of our patriarchs, can coexist in the world, how to create a harmonious balance between them, how to nurture kindness, hospitality, generosity, and love, but also to give attention to our boundaries and limits, allowing both to be integrated in ourselves and in the world. Perhaps it is this theological or theosophical, to be precise, structure of balance that is required when we think about the trajectory and speed of our evolution and discoveries, whether in agricultural science or artificial intelligence, computer science or technology, medical advances, warfare, or space discovery. The arc of history will not suddenly come to an end. The human species is intelligent, curious, restless, and sometimes selfish and greedy. The quality of chesed knows no bounds, but must at times be restrained and regulated by the attribute of gevurah. The harmony and integration of both may allow us to lessen the risks to our environment, to mitigate against the unknown and mighty potential of artificial intelligence, to create a society of welcoming and hospitality, where strangers can realize their true selves, not by being dependent on the state, but through work and purposeful activity. At the heart of what is seen as an existential struggle for democracy in Israel is this requirement for a balance between unrestrained power and authority on the one hand, and on the other, the limits that must be set by an independent judiciary. We must not lose hope that this struggle for integration will take place, but it requires an end to the oppressive and violent steps that the Israeli government is taking towards the annexation of the occupied territories. As an Israeli friend said some weeks ago, Israel is a young state. It does not have the benefit of an 800-year-old Magna Carta of human rights. It will take time and determination for democracy and freedom to become established, and perhaps even longer for a pluralist and peaceful state to be created, where Israelis and Palestinians can live side by side and not in unequal, fortified enclaves. Where we can take heart today is from the recent developments of our own progressive movements here in the UK. It has taken nearly 120 years to bring together liberal Judaism and Reform Judaism in a step that surprised but also uplifted us just a few months ago. During these past decades, many of us wondered why we needed two separate progressive organizations, and from time to time, there were initiatives, both rabbinic and lay, to talk about uniting, to confederate, or even merge. As I said at our meeting in July with the CEOs of our two movements, Rabbi Charlie Baginski and Rabbi Josh Levy, there is a PhD thesis to write about the relationship between liberal and Reform Judaism in matters of status, conversion, divorce, liturgy, theology, communal politics, and many other things. Today, there is a hair's breadth, if that, between us on these issues. A new movement for progressive Judaism, embracing both our movements and our synagogues, 80+ synagogues in all, opens up huge spiritual and moral possibilities, giving us a larger platform for our voices to be heard on a host of different issues, including social justice, Israel, spirituality, and many of the subjects I have touched on this morning. We do not need to fear that the uniqueness of our own community here at the LJS will be compromised. Communities do not aspire to be uniform, but to carve out their own individuality in prayer, in music, in learning, social action, pastoral care, and many, many other things. This integration of our two movements into one should give us great hope and optimism, not only for progressive Judaism in the future, but much more widely in our fragmented world. As we hear the cry of the shofar, the boldness and brokenness of its notes, may we too find a way to contain and integrate the qualities of chesed, loving kindness, generosity, and open-handedness, with gevurah, the need for restraint and for boundaries in our own lives. May we begin the new year with optimism and hope, that if the two attributes are balanced within each one of us, so they will find their equilibrium and integration in the world about us. May God grant you and all your dear ones a healthy and peaceful Rosh Hashanah. Amen.